The internet seems to be ablaze with rumors and speculation about the PlayStation 5. Everywhere I turn, people are talking about it. There's threads made over at Reset Era. It seems to be a thing. And I'm sure you guys have seen a lot of my fellow YouTubers making videos about supposed specs that this system will have. Well, I'm not going to talk about the specs, but I will talk about when possibly this system is going to release. What is going on, guys? Randall Thor 19, the man with the million, back again with another video. And yeah, I'm not going to really touch on the specs, whether it's 10 teraflops, 12 teraflops, or 20 teraflops, or what CPU it's going to have, if it's a Ryzen or if it's not. Honestly, I don't really know anything about that stuff. I couldn't really give you any useful information. So if you want to learn more about the specs that the system might have, go read a thread about it on Reset Era, or I'm sure there's other YouTubers who have made videos about it that are well more versed into all this stuff than I am. Now, what I wanted to talk about is when you're going to get this system in your hands. When is Sony actually going to drop the bombshell and release this system? I know there's been some talk that it's 2018. I would imagine that I would definitely 100% say that is not going to happen. There's no way Sony is releasing a PlayStation 5 this year. I don't even know why somebody would even think that is the case. The only really two dates we're looking at, or at least 2 years we're looking at here, is 2019 and 2020. And from a lot of PlayStation fans I know, not a lot of them are even asking for a PlayStation 5 at this point. There's a ton of great games coming this year and a slew of games coming in the future. I mean, just this year you have God of War, you have Spider-Man, you had Shadow of the Colossus, a whole bunch of games, and you still have Death Stranding to come. You still have The Last of Us 2 coming, Ghost of Tsushima, Days Gone. There's a whole slew of games in the pipeline. So a lot of people are like, hey, I feel like the gen is just starting to get its legs under it. It's just starting to be good, and you're just going to end that by having the PS5 come out. I mean, people are saying like, hey, PlayStation's dominating. You're up to almost 80 million sold. You're going to be close to 100 million by the end of the year. You don't necessarily need a PlayStation 5 to come out in 2019. Just wait for 2020. The thing about business is like you always got to be planning your next product, and Sony and Microsoft are both doing that. And from everything I've seen and from the people I've talked to, there is a very high probability that the PlayStation 5 will be releasing in 2019. I've heard that dev kits are in the hands of some third-party developers making games for the system. And if that's the case, then we got to look at it like that. You know, 2019 seems like a viable option if some developers already have PlayStation 5 dev kits in their hands. And I know a lot of fans are like, "What? We don't need it. Look at all these games coming." And it is true, there are a ton of games coming, but you also got to look at how Sony has always done this. Yeah, there's tons of games yet to release, but just go back to the previous gen. Go back to 2013 and look at the games that Sony dropped knowing the PS4 was coming that year. I mean, people seem to think like you just don't release any exclusives in a year and then the system comes out and then all the stuff is made then. That's not true. That's not how Sony operates. I mean, just in 2013, the year the PlayStation 4 was coming, Sony dropped Sly Cooper, Thieves in Time, which was a brand new Sly Cooper game. Now, granted, they haven't revisited that since 2013, but that was an exclusive. They dropped God of War Ascension. Granted, it was maybe a critical and commercial, non-starter, but it was very much a new God of War game. So so you had Sly Cooper, you have God of War, you had Gran Turismo 6, at the time the biggest franchise in PlayStation history. You had Beyond Two Souls as well, and not to mention The Last of Us. So Sony dropped a ton of exclusive games, like 5 I just mentioned, in 2013, even though they were just about ready to drop a new system at the end of the year. So when I see the argument is like, oh, it can't be 2019 because we still haven't gotten The Last of Us 2 and Death Stranding and Ghost of Tsushima and Days Gone, I just say refer back to 2013. It's entirely possible Sony will release Ghost of Tsushima, Death Stranding, Last of Us 2, and Days Gone next year, and then at the end of 2019 release a brand new PlayStation 5 with a whole slew of exclusive games coming out for it. And honestly, considering that I think the PlayStation 5 will be fully back compat, all the games that you own on the PlayStation 4, you'll be able to play on your PlayStation 5. The need of actually kind of having really kick-ass exclusives, at least in the very beginning launch window, I'm sure there will be some, but that'll be lessened because a lot of people won't have played some of these new games. And Sony, of course, always likes to remaster a lot of their games. They did it for The Last of Us and the Uncharted collection. This gen, they bundled up Beyond Two Souls and Heavy Rain. They remastered God of War 3. So all those games could take the power of the new, PlayStation 4. I would imagine even if you had back compat, which I expect it to be there, I would imagine there would be a Last of Us 2 remaster or a Death Stranding remaster or any of that stuff for those games at the end of that gen, so they could then resell you those games and have them run at 4K 60 or whatever it would be, whatever the new system would be powerful enough to run at. I mean, that's kind of what Sony loves to do. So the whole argument that like they have too many games left to release, it doesn't make sense to release the PlayStation 5 next year, doesn't hold water with me, just based on Sony's previous history, right? And then some people would also say, well, when would they announce this system? If it's truly 2019, when would they announce it? It was like, it'd be just like they always do. It's usually February of that year. They would have a press meeting in New York. It would be streamed. It'd be an hour long. And they would talk about the future games that would be coming out, for the system at launch and in the launch window. But that didn't hurt the sales of Last of Us because we all know how much that game sold. It didn't really hurt the sales of any of these other games. I mean, God of War, you could argue, was hurt, but only because it was a mediocre game. So I seriously doubt announcing a PlayStation 5 for release at the end of 2019 will hurt the sales of Days Gone or any of those games. People are wanting to play those games because they look awesome and they look really good. And the PlayStation 5 is probably going to be potentially quite expensive. I mean, you have the PlayStation 4 Pro that still sells for around $400. So if it really does come out in 2019, who knows what the PlayStation 5 is going to look like. And then there's the other factor you got to consider of maybe getting the jump on Microsoft and really kind of sticking it to them. Now, Microsoft just released the Xbox One X last year. It's only like 6 months old at this point. But there is, of course, some competition between all these companies. They all want to dominate the generation because the more systems you sell, the users you get into your ecosystem, the more people you can sell your subscriptions to and your games to, which you take a cut of your money. So, like, you want to be first. You want to have the most. And getting out first for Sony in 2019 and essentially converting most, or at least some, of the massive PlayStation 4 user base into PS5 owners would be a great benefit to Sony. Having the year on the market to yourself is always huge. Look what it did for the 360 back in 2005. One of the reasons the 360 was so dominant that gen, or at least in comparison to the original Xbox and the Xbox One, was because it had a year on the market to itself. By the time the PlayStation 3 and the Wii came out a year later, Microsoft was getting these pseudo-exclusives because they were first. And developers could dev for that system. You guys remember how many games were developed first for the sell? It wasn't that many. It was because the 360 had the audience, and it had a lot of exclusive games in the beginning, where the PlayStation 3 was just trying to get its footing. So people chose the 360. I mean, look back at the games it had. Saints Row, the Elder Scrolls, the BioShocks, the Gears of Wars. It just goes on. The list of games that the 360 had exclusive in the beginning is staggering. And the PlayStation 3 really couldn't compete with that. It was more expensive, true, but also couldn't compete with any of that stuff. Right? So Sony is, considering the company of Sony itself is all about PlayStation, they need the PlayStation to be a gigantic success. They can't have it falter. So if you can get a jump on Microsoft by a year, because, I mean, who knows if Microsoft is willing and able to get a Xbox 2 out there in 2019 when they literally just released one 6 months ago, right? And I know people would say, well, it would be, the PlayStation would be less powerful than the Xbox 2 if the Xbox 2 released a year later. And while that would be true, the extra sales that PlayStation would get from being, the only one on the market might, offset the fact that they wouldn't be as powerful as the next Xbox. But, I mean, just as a gamer, can you imagine what Naughty Dog could do with the new CPU and the new GPUs and stuff like that? I mean, look at God of War and what it's doing on the base PS4 and the PS4 Pro, and look what Spider-Man's doing, and then imagine the next gen and what they could do with that. It would be quite amazing, or quite astonishing to see what they could come up with. But, like I said, it's very much a possibility that Sony's like, we're going to get the jump on everybody. They did say that the PS4 Pro was a mid-gen console, and it would be coming up on 6 years, and they released it 3 years in life cycle. That is the strictest definition of mid-gen. Launch of the PS4 in 2013, launch of the Pro in 2016, and 3 years later, 2019, there you go, PlayStation 5. And honestly, 6 years is about right for a generation. I know a lot of people maybe who just got into gaming last gen think 8 years or so is about the length of a generation, but that is the exception. The rule has always been roughly about 5 years, 4 to 5 years for a generation, and then you move on. So if Sony's really planning on releasing in 2019, it's a tad bit longer than normal, but some people who just started gaming last gen were probably thinking like, well, this is way too short. Like, I'm starting to finally get some great games, but this is how it's kind of always been, and I would assume that, Sony's been, prepared this for a long time, that they have games and exclusives, locked away from developers that haven't really done anything for a while, or, that they could put on the PlayStation 5. Maybe it's even possible that, these games next year could be cross-gen launch titles. I mean, nobody said they weren't. It could entirely possible. Last of Us 2 could be a cross-gen launch title. And the PS5 launch titles are just some of the PS4 games. But it's about the competition. I would imagine Xbox wouldn't like to be left behind for a full year. I mean, that would have to hurt. In fact, you would think Microsoft would rush production to match Sony to give it to 2019. So, honestly, with the news that the dev kits are out there, that some people have the specs, it's starting to really look like 2019 might be the year. And I know that might kind of not sit well with a lot of Sony fans, but their previous history shows they're willing to launch a console during a year where they still have a ton of exclusives. And if you look at it, all those exclusives are scheduled for 2019. They don't really have anything scheduled for 2020, but that's what E3 would be for. They would announce a new PlayStation experience, or whatever they would call it in New York. They would be like, here's the PlayStation 5 and some games, and at E3 that year, it would be a blowout about the system, and everything would be 2020 and beyond. And 2019 would just be the end of the PlayStation 4. And honestly, what a better way to end it than with The Last of Us 2? That's how you ended the PS3 generation. Maybe that's exactly how you end the PS4 generation. And considering that the system still is roughly $250, the PlayStation 4 is still going to sell for years. It has an incredible catalog of games. So Sony wants to get in their next-gen system. That'll really be a jump up over the Pro. It's got some new exclusives on the way. It gets a year head start on Microsoft and the next Xbox. And it just starts the domination once again. So honestly, the more and more I think about it, I really do think the next system is coming in 2019. Only time will tell, I guess. But anyways, that is the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, share this out on social media, hit that sub button, the notification bell, all that good stuff. And I want to thank all you guys for watching. I really appreciate it. And I'll see everybody in the next video. Later, guys.